Keeping the peace, the sergeant of police slipped out of the back bar of the Central, out of the hotel by the back way. Not that he did so guiltily. He was smirking broadly as he wiped his graying gingerish moustache, as if still savoring the jokes he had been swapping with the publican, along with the lingering taste of the beer. He was a big man, ruddy inclined to the puffy fleshiness of the drinker of much beer. He wore the Queensland country policeman's uniform, blue shirt with silver buttons and badges, khaki slacks, the slouch hat. His pockets bulged with the mail he had collected since its sorting a couple of hours ago. It was his habit to meet the mail train every morning and then to enjoy the hospitality of one or other of his friends, the hotel keepers, for an hour or so before lunch. He was not above enjoying himself likewise also at other times of the day, being a man who liked his beer and company. As everybody knew, he didn't have much of a life at home. The reason for his seemingly shamefaced mode of leaving the hotel was simply that he was not going straight home today. From the laneway at the back of the Central, he turned into the short street leading down to the showground. The showground, which functioned as a place of entertainment rarely, was otherwise used as a refuge for what, in Queensland, are called travellers. These are itinerants who are either too poor, too mean, or otherwise unable or unwilling to avail themselves of more usual forms of lodging. It is customary in the free and easy rural communities to allow them to use of such public places as showgrounds. That there were travellers in residence now was evident. A couple of battered motor vehicles and a splay-wheeled buggy stood at the back of the pavilion, and smoke was issuing from the flue in the shed used as a refreshment room in show time. A couple of dogs came lolloping out to challenge the sergeant, only to be called immediately to heel by the gruff voice of invisible masters. The residents were at lunch, ranged along a bench on one side of a table that faced the door. There were half a dozen or so, all men. Most of them were the usual seedy, grubby types. One was an ancient, hook-nosed black man. One was distinguished by being shaved and comparatively decently clad, a squat, squarish fellow of middle age, with a high-bald brow and intense blue eyes in meaty sockets and jowls. The seedy fellows concentrated on their plates as the sergeant presented himself in the doorway, attacking their food like dogs, fearful of having it snatched away. The swarthy ancient defied the intruder with a raptorial glance. The meaty blue eyes of the square man grew round, and his jowls quivered. The sergeant halted in the doorway, greeting the gathering amiably and wheezingly. "Day all, how's things?" Only the square man answered, mumbling. The sergeant leant with a hand on the door frame, casting a policeman's glance about the room, then saying, "That's how I like to see the place, nice and tidy." Those that eyed him did so warily. He chuckled. "Easy see, you're bachelors. It's the married blokes make the mess. That's because a married man reckons he might well do something to be picked on by his old woman, for seein' she'll pick on him whatever he does, eh? Ha ha ha." A couple of the men grinned feebly. The old darky leered. The sergeant asked, "You all just passin' through, I suppose?" A rumble of assent. He stood for a moment surveying them, then, with a wheezy sigh, said, "Well, seein' you're all bachelors, you're no concern of mine. I'm looking for a wife deserter." They might all have been wife deserters by the guilty look of them, but he put them at their ease immediately, chuckling chestily. If any bloke turns up here with that wild look in his eye of the runaway husband who still hears his old woman's voice in his ears, give him my congratulations and tell him I'll be back this way in the course of my investigations tomorrow morning if he's got the time to spare. Ha ha ha. Most of the audience tittered. The old darky cackled. The square man's sagging features jerked. The sergeant turned. Well, better be getting along to lunch, or I'll have it chucked at me. Ha ha ha, so long. He went his way. The police station was the usual yellow-painted villa on high stilts, with the underneath section latticed in and used as garage and laundry. Part of the house was residence. Behind the villa were the quarters of the assistant constable, a small bungalow. Across the way from the bungalow was the lockup, a small skillen-built structure comprising a couple of cells fronted with a veranda screened with steel mesh. Beside the jail was the wood heap, means of employment for the rare prisoners it held. The jail was now empty, its doors wide. Most of what was behind was only to be glimpsed just then, because the yard was crowded with washing billowing in the noonday breeze. A woman was at work in the laundry. The sergeant climbed the steep stairs to the official part. Inside he took off his hat and tossed it onto a peg on the wall. There was a line of such pegs, hung with police gear, handcuffs, and pistols in holsters, and beneath was a rack containing rifles. Casement windows looked out on three sides, including the rear. He had time only to take out the mail when the angry-sounding tintinnabulation of a dinner gong rang through the house. He flung the letters down and went to a door through which he went into the residence. By way of a shiny passage, he went through to the combined dining room and kitchen at the rear. A woman was at the stove, turned at his entrance with an expression that, if it did not betray actual intention to throw the dinner she was dishing in his face, plainly showed to wish to do so. She did not speak. She was a striking woman, not for beauty, but for strength expressed in feature and form. Her face might have been classical in its lineaments, but for a button-tip nose it might have been that very fault, cancelling out beauty which made her the scold she was so obviously betrayed as with that expression. His acknowledgment of her presence was an inarticulate grumbling as he seated himself. She resumed her dishing. Just then a figure appeared in the doorway leading to the back stairs. It was a slatternly, half-caste woman. The sergeant looked at the woman in evident surprise, grunting, "You Gilgi, eh?" The woman answered only with a glance under beetling brows as she went barefoot towards the stove. The sergeant's wife dished food onto a tin plate for Gilgi. Neither woman spoke, not even when the plate was handed over and Gilgi turned to go. The sergeant's wife came to the table carrying a dish topped with a golden crust. He dropped his eyes before the glare she gave him. As she set down the dish, she spoke in a grating voice. "No thanks to you, that gen's here." He merely fiddled with his fork. She went on, "The sergeant of police can't even get a black gen to help with his wife's washing." He growled, "What are you moaning for? She's here, isn't she?" Her voice came harsher. "I said no thanks to you. Peter had to get her for me." He looked at her. "Eh?" Her voice rose. The blacks have no more respect for you than anyone else in the place has. That Jen wouldn't come for you, so I asked Peter to get her. She came all right for him because he's a real policeman." His ruddy face darkened and he snorted. "Peter had no right to do anything without my authority." "Ta-ha, your authority," he rumbled. "That'll do. With your authority, he'd only be going round apologizing for being a policeman. He'd only be going round boozing, pandering to every crook in the town, making himself cheap even with tramps." He dropped the fork and slapped the table with his big red hand, bellowing. "I said that will do." She opened her mouth to go on, but closed it as steps sounded on the back stairs. She swung away, back to the stove. In a moment a tall young policeman entered, dark-eyed, curly-haired. He stopped to sniff loudly, then cried, "Steak pie, you beaut." The woman looked at him with face transformed. The harsh lines were softened to the mere harassment of the years. She came smiling with the vegetables, while the constable seated himself. The constable addressed himself to both of them to begin with, while the sergeant's wife at the head of the table dished. But soon he was talking only to her and she to him. He had met someone he knew passing through on the mail train, who knew someone she knew in the police. It was evident from her talk that her all-abiding interest was in this sphere in which she lived. She served her husband first, without looking at him, a small portion for so big a man, but the helping she gave the young man was such as to cause him to voice a laughing protest. "Hey, you'll have me looking like Tubby Tanner." She said primly, "I think Inspector Tanner's condition is a credit to Miss Tanner's cooking. I do like a man with a big appetite." For a while they ate in silence. Then the constable spoke to the sergeant. "I suspect that half-caste Bray mob of ratting parts for that old bomb of theirs." The sergeant grunted. "Huh? Yup, they must be pinchin' 'em off, those wrecks in the yard back of Price's service station." The young man continued. "When I was out there after Gilgy this morning, I found 'em working on their truck. I asked 'em where they got the parts. They reckoned from some mate of theirs, but you can always tell when boons are lying. Their faces quiver. I'm going to check up with Price and see if he's losing any of his junk." The sergeant said with his mouth full, "What for?" "Eh?" The sergeant growled. "You said yourself it's junk." The constable replied stiffly, "It's still Price's property, and it's still an offense for anyone to help themselves to other people's property. If Price is losing anything of value, he'll lay a complaint himself." Reddening, the young man expostulated, "But when it is suspected that an offense has been committed—" The sergeant wheezed. "Offense, offense, offense. You can find an offense in pretty well anything anybody does, if you've a mind to it." For a moment the constable stared into the blue eyes before him, then gave attention to his plate. But then the wife, who had been watching both men, spoke, her voice again rasping, and her face seamed with that ill humor. "If a police officer's duty isn't to look for offenses and put a stop to them, then I don't know what is." The sergeant looked as if he would have ignored her, only foreseeing the quick raising of the constable's eyes, whereupon he said, addressing no one in particular, "A police officer's first duty is to keep the peace. You can't do that by prying into everything everybody does. You only antagonize people like that." Her voice suddenly became shrill. "Antagonizing, that's all you think of. What to do not to antagonize crooks and loafers and good-for-nothing blacks." With darkening face he turned on her, and his voice rumbled deeper. "That'll do, Hilda." Her whole frame quivered as she leaned forward to deliver herself. Will it do? It's your namby-pamby, cowardly dodging, doing your duty, what you call keeping the peace, that keeps you only a second-class sergeant in third-class towns, when you could have been an inspector with your own district years ago. And all I can say is that if Peter does his duty like you do, he'll get just nowhere like you too. His great hand struck the table. He roared. I said, that will do. For a moment she stood there, glaring, panting, seeming to mouth words beyond expression. Then suddenly she left the table, rushed from the dining room inside. The sergeant sighed heavily, wheezily. Women. The constable applied himself vigorously to his eating. The sergeant ate without interest, pushed his plate away uncleaned, quaffed his cup of tea, then, belching, rose. The constable looked up at him and said hurriedly, like a small boy seeking to win favor, "If you like, Sarge, I'll get the electoral roll business started this arvo, eh?" The sergeant stood for a moment, running a hand over his bristly gray beard. "Okay, Peter, anything you like." He left the room and returned through the house to his office. He sank into his swivel chair, took up pipe and tobacco. Smoking, he swung himself to face the rear windows, to sit with feet outstretched, half reclining, staring out upon the waving banners of wash day, from time to time belching. He was still sitting, but now with pipe lying on the desk and his red chins sunk on his blue tie, dozing when steps sounded on the outside stairs. He started awake, swung round to face the outer door. There appeared in the doorway a man of stocky, squarish build. He carried a haversack and a thin rolled swag. The sergeant greeted him with the amiable wheeze. "Ah, saw you down the showground, didn't I?" The blue eyes blinked owlishly in their meaty sockets. "That's right, Sergeant." The man slipped his burden, entered the office, doffing his hat. His voice was quiet and cultivated. "I'm the man you want for wife desertion, Sergeant." The sergeant looked surprised. "Eh, what man? I didn't name any names." The jowls quivered like an old dog's. "The name is Arthur Ernest Wigmore." Lolling back in his chair, pressing red hands to his protuberant middle, the sergeant grunted. "It could have been any man there I wanted. Most probably they were all wife deserters. I know there's a warrant out for me, Sergeant. There's warrants out for hundreds of wife deserters, man." Wigmore blinked and broke the silence that followed. Don't you apprehend them. What's the good? If a couple can't get on together, they're better parted. And if a man hates his old woman that much, he'd rather live outside the law than support her. Nothing'll make him do it for longer than it takes him to go on the lam again. Wigmore nodded. "Yes, and all for the want of a little give and take." The sergeant chuckled deeply. "Most probably it's give and take's the trouble. Give the old woman an inch, and she'll take a mile." Far from responding to the jest, Wigmore looked even more the sad old dog. Sensuously he responded, "Actually, a man who can't make a success of his marriage makes a complete failure of his life." The sergeant gaped. "Eh? To be truly successful, you have to win the admiration and respect of your fellows. If you can't win the admiration and respect of your wife—" The sergeant exploded. "Get out with you, man. There are some women the angel Gabriel couldn't win with." "I beg to differ, Sergeant. I think that things go wrong in marriage when the wife sees that the husband doesn't measure up to being the man he pretends to be beforehand." "What about the wife not measuring up too?" "It's disappointment in her man that changes the wife. I know my married life would have been very different if only I'd done the things my wife wanted me to instead of just resenting the fact that she wasn't content to accept me the way I was contented to be. Eyeing the other quizzically, the sergeant asked, "How long you been married?" 15 years. Thought you's goin' to say 15 months. How long since you bolted? It's just 7 weeks since I left home. Starting to miss the home comforts, eh? I've missed my home life all the time, Sergeant. I'm going back because I've realized my mistake. You reckon things'll be different in future?" The jowls quivered with the earnestness of the reply. "They've just got to be, Sergeant." "It was that bad, was it?" "Yes, Sergeant, it was bad, but the fault was mine entirely." The sergeant sighed. "I think you're dreaming, man. But it's your business, not mine." The jowls lifted in a faint smile. "It's your business to execute the warrant." The sergeant looked surprised. That would mean you'd be sent back in custody." "Exactly. But man, if you're going home of your own free will—" "I don't want it to look like that, Sergeant." The sergeant stared. Wigmore went on. "My wife shows she wants me back by swearing out a warrant to have me arrested and made to return. Get out, she probably only wants you back so's to take a court action against you for maintenance. That's mostly only what deserted wives want when they swear out a warrant. My wife isn't in want. We have a bit of property. It's in her name." The sergeant grinned. "Maybe she's lost without someone to nag at." The dog's face blinked sad reproach. The sergeant said, "Do you realize that if you're taken in custody, it'll be in court that you'll first see your wife? That's how I want it, Sergeant." The sergeant showed his bewilderment by rubbing a red hand over his bristly gray beard. Wigmore went on in his earnest voice. "Things were pretty strained at home for a good while before I left. I'm a sensitive fool. I get hurt very deeply, and sometimes deeply roused. As a matter of fact, I left because I was afraid of doing violence. Oh, I know now that the things that hurt me were said only to rouse me to do something to make her proud of me for. Going back's going to be a bit awkward for both of us, the way things were. Like this, it will be easier. Like this, it'll be easier. I can say something in court about the way I feel now. I saw that after you came there this morning. I saw then that your coming was a godsend." There was a little silence, while the sergeant lolled back staring, and Wigmore looked past him into the backyard scene, where domesticity was mixed up with the harsh institutions of the law, where women of the household changed sheets about against the background of the jailhouse. Then the sergeant leaned forward, speaking in a confidential rumble. "Listen, mate, I reckon you ought to think things over a bit more before you commit yourself to going back. If things don't turn out the way you hope, you're going to get a bit of a shock. And if you don't mind me saying so, you're asking a lot expecting a big change in your lives now. You're not morally bound to go back, seeing you're providing for her. You've made the break, which is the hardest part. Stick it out just for a couple of weeks more." Wigmore broke in. "No, Sergeant, no. All I want to do is go home. Take me into custody, please." The sergeant sat staring for a moment longer, then wheezed his resignation. "Okay, but I won't charge you yet. I'll take you in as a vagrant. A couple of good feeds and a comfortable night's sleep might make you feel different. We'll have another talk tomorrow. Meantime, you can concentrate on the wood heap. Firewood supply getting a bit low." Wigmore also sighed. "Thank you, Sergeant. I'm much obliged." After having taken Wigmore down to the lock-up, the sergeant returned to his office to find Peter, the young constable, there. Peter said, "We got a prisoner, eh?" The sergeant grunted. "Just a vagrant." Glancing significantly at the charge book, Peter said, "You haven't charged him yet," the sergeant said distantly. "He's only some poor feller wants a feed and a bed." Peter hung there a moment, evidently at a loss. Then sighing, as one who has to accept anomalies, he turned away, saying, "Oh well, I'll be getting up town to see about the electoral business. Be back for smoko." The sergeant settled down at his desk to his paperwork. Soon the sounds of his prisoner at his allotted labor came floating up to him, rasp of cross-cut saw and ring of axe, and to demonstrate the prisoner's mood, his voice, a warbling tenor, occasionally raised in song. "I's a gwine back to Dixie. I can't stay here no longer." The sergeant was jerked out of preoccupation with his papers by a new sound, another voice, female, shrill, rising to mingle with the tenor. Shut up that singing, will you?" The singing stopped. For a while the sergeant sat with head cocked to the rear windows, not looking so much as listening, because nothing of what was going on down there in the backyard was visible from the desk. Now there was silence, save for the flapping of the washing. Then the axe rang out again. The sergeant returned to his work. Down at the wood heap by the lockup, Wigmore was splitting the blocks he had sawn and loading the billets into a barrow, smirking broadly despite the rude interruption to his chosen mode of expressing his happiness, his flabby face running sweat and smudged from his handling the charred wood. At length, with the barrow filled, Wigmore set out with it, heading for the laundry beneath the house, dodging through the washing on the way. He presented himself at the doorway. Inside were the mistress of the house and her laundress, Gilgy, busy with damping down and ironing. Smirking, he cried, "Good afternoon, ladies, good afternoon. Herewith my contribution to the domestic economy. Where'll I put it?" Eyeing him stonily, the mistress flung a finger towards the wood box, then to all appearances repudiated his existence utterly. But soon she was screeching at him as he unloaded the wood. "That wood's no good, take it away." He turned to her, gaping. What's the matter with it?" "Do you expect me to handle wood like that? Take it away and cut the black off it." He blinked at her in his owlish way. She demanded, "What are you staring at?" His jowls quivered into a sickly grin. He muttered, just like her. Her eyes blazed. "What'd you say?" The smile vanished. "I said you reminded me of someone. Don't be impertinent." His face reddened and his voice came thick. "Impertinence wasn't intended. It'd be better not to be." Wigmore's jowls jerked and his eyes rolled in their meaty sockets. It's in a strangled voice he said, "Madame, what I said." She screeched, "I don't care what you said. I don't hold conversations with the likes of you. Get back to the work you were ordered to do, or I'll call the police officer." Up in his office the sergeant, hearing the sounds of contention below, rose and went to a rear window. He saw Wigmore come out of the laundry with the barrow. He could not see the man's face, but his mood was obvious enough in the way he rushed across the yard, through the washing, and dumped his load back on the wood heap. Smudges on a pair of sheets marked the passage of his angry going. Eyeing the smudges, the sergeant grimaced. Then, shrugging, he returned to his typewriter. Soon the axe was heard again. Perhaps 5 minutes passed while the sergeant transferred his official thinking to paper through the medium of two sausage-like red index fingers. Then suddenly there was contention again below, that same grating female voice, the rumbling masculine answering back. The sergeant groaned and hammered harder, but there was no drowning the row, which was centered now out in the middle of the yard by the sound of it. It rose to screeching and bellowing, Snorting, the sergeant rose again. The disputants were out by the wood heap. Wigmore was leaning on his axe, vociferating. The sergeant's wife waving the soiled washing in his face. Her shrilling came up to the sergeant. "You useless, good-for-nothing tramp, you did it on purpose." At that Wigmore's bellow broke into a hoarse scream, and he raised the axe. The woman shrieked, flung the clothes in the man's face, leapt back, fetched up against the wire mesh of the lock-up veranda. The man leapt after her, flinging away the clothes, tripped over a log and fell. She tore her way along the wire to the open doorway, made it as the man rose. She scrambled through the doorway, snatched at the wooden door, flung it shut in his face. His axe smashed into the door. Crash! Her voice rose up above the madman's screaming. "Help! Help!" The sergeant leaned back from the window and grabbed a rifle from the rack, glanced again at the scene across the yard as he jerked the lever of the rifle and shot a cartridge into the breech. Wigmore was battering the door down, raging, "Help! Help! Help!" The sergeant dropped to his knee. Wigmore's squarish, gray-clad back came into sight. The sergeant's fat red finger tightened on the trigger. In that instant the gray became blue, a flash of silver buttons. A blue arm shot out. Wigmore went down in a heap at the feet of the young constable. The sergeant sank back on his heels. Sweat oozed from his redness. He got up stiffly, turned back to the rack, replaced the rifle with shaking hands. He went out through the house and down by the back stairs, past the blubbering half-caste woman at the laundry door, and out across the yard. He found his wife clinging to Peter, the constable weeping wildly. Wigmore was sitting on the ground, looking stupefied, his wrist in handcuffs. Peter said, "Everything under control, Sarge." The sergeant wheezed at his wife. "You all right, Hilda?" She let go Peter and turned on her husband, and her voice came grating through her tears. "No thanks to you, I'm all right." He grunted, "Erg," and he proceeded to fish in his pocket and produced a key. Her voice rose as she went on, giving a madman an axe to run about with. The sergeant grunted, "That'll do, Hilda," and he bent over Wigmore and unlocked the handcuffs. She screeched, "That'll do, will it? If it hadn't been for Peter, I'd have been murdered. Why are you unhandcuffing that madman?" He looked at her with darkening face and rumbled, "I said, that'll do." He looked down at Wigmore, who was blinking up at him in his owlish way, and said, "Get up and get your swag and get going." His wife cried, "Don't tell me you're going to let that murderer go free." "He's not a murderer. He tried to murder me. He tried to attack you after you'd strongly provoked him. I heard everything, saw everything." "You mean to say you watched your wife being chased by a madman with an axe?" "Yes, I watched through the sights of a rifle, and could have dropped him the moment you were in real danger. If I charge him with anything, I'll have to state that you provoked the attack. You don't want that, do you?" She stood rigid, with eyes blazing, breast heaving, lips writhing on words beyond articulation. Then suddenly she rushed away. The sergeant said to Wigmore, as he came out carrying his swag, "Now, on your way, and take my advice and make your way anywhere but back to that old woman of yours, because if you do, you'll be in trouble for sure. Like I told you, there's some women you couldn't win with if you were the angel Gabriel." Mercy flight. What is called a mercy flight is properly one in which normal safety standards of aerial operation, as imposed by air navigation orders, are relaxed to meet certain contingencies. To quote A.N.O.'s for humane reasons, to save or relieve some person from grave and imminent danger. Does this cover a flight undertaken to save a soul, which to some people would be considered even more urgent than to save a life? A pilot needs to know the score exactly in the matter of A&Os. In this case, a tacit warning is given by an addendum to the definition. The responsibility for determining whether to conduct a mercy flight rests solely with the pilot in command. One time I fell for a mercy flight required to be made to save a soul rather than a life, but curiously it wasn't anxiety for the soul I was asked to assist in saving that involved me, personally, so much as concern for the soul of him I was assisting, the saver of souls himself. How would a man stand in respect to A&Os if he came to grief in a case like that? Anyway, such were the hazards of that flight, that had I come to grief, I wouldn't have been interested in any official inquiry into the circumstances, well, not any earthly one. I was charter flying with a light aircraft concern, operating out of a small port on the eastern side of Cape York Peninsula, Queensland. I prefer not to name the town. Suffice it to say that immediately behind it rises one of the highest parts of the Coast Range. It is a region of tricky weather, especially round about the autumnal equinox, when the trade wind blows up again and the warm, moist air from over the coral sea becomes a wet stream that obliterates the mountains and cooks up nasty little frontal systems to lurk as traps for unwary pilots. That's the way it was the time I tell of. The little saver of souls came to me while I was taking advantage of the rain to indulge in a bit of after-lunch bashing of the spine in my hotel room. He came so sure of the undeniability of his mission that he had his gear for the trip, which he set down on the veranda outside my door. He was wearing a plastic raincoat, through which could be seen his tubby figure, clad in bush cleric's outfit of khaki safari jacket, shorts, top socks. He doffed his black hat to shake off the rain, revealing a crop of brown curls. I rose from bed, eyeing the valise outside, saying, "Hello, Padre, you wouldn't be thinking of flying, would you?" His chubby face dimpled with a Serpa's smile. "And why not? In this weather? Since when you've been scared of weather?" "Just about ever since I took to flying." "Go on with you. What about that time we came home in rain, so heavy we couldn't see the ground till we were nearly down on it?" "That's very different from going out into rain." "It is, too. The occasion he referred to was one on which I ran into rain halfway across the mountains on the way home from a trip out west. I knew the weather was clagging up, and wanted to beat it to avoid being stuck out on some poky little cattle station for a week or more. Unless you have a fully instrumented kite, it is bad flying to lose contact with ground. Few light aircraft are so equipped. What made that bit of recklessness permissible was the fact that all I had to do was maintain height for the few minutes required to bring me out over the sea, drop down in absolute safety till I could see the sea, then steer a compass course to the shore, pick up a landmark, and head straight into the drome. As I went out to him I said, "If you wanted to go up or down the coast, it'd be okay, But you want to go over the top, don't you, out to Magoffin?" He nodded, looking grave. "You've heard. The Flying Doctor Service radioed asking about the weather. I told 'em they'd never find Banyan in this." He said quickly, "But you could." "Not a hope, but would it be the same over the other side of the mountains? It's often clear over there when it's raining here. Banyan's too close to the mountains to be clear of weather like this." His face became blank with dismay, his blue eyes round, his boyish alto vibrant. "Well, if you took me out farther west, then, and I were to come back to Banyan by road, how am I going to get you over the mountains? Can't we fly over the clouds? Not in a kite like mine. Anyway, with the roads like they are just now, you'd be days getting back to Banyan. You might as well wait here till the weather breaks." "When will that be?" "I'd say 3 days." "But Magoffin won't last that long. Doctor said that when he finally goes down, he'll die in a matter of hours. Can't you really take me?" I could see he didn't accept my head shake. I turned to look northward into the murk. Away on some peak, the atmospheric differences were being hammered out in a storm, the rumble of which could be heard faintly. I said, "Listen to that." But he got in front of me, tugging at my sleeve, urging, "Look, this is terribly urgent. You know the sort of man Magoffin has been. I want to be with him at the last. I'm certain we can get there if you'll share my faith." The unbelief he saw in my eyes seemed to smite him like a slap to a trusting child. If he had abused me for irreligion, it would have been easy to take compared with that look. Deep down, I cursed that old reprobate Magoffin for involving me in his sinfulness. Relief came for me in the shape of the man from the fuel depot drawing up with his little tanker outside the hotel bar. I said hastily, "Excuse me, Padre, I have to see Joe." As I turned to escape, I added, "The old boy might last out. He's tough, and you never know. The weather might break sooner." I must confess to making a joke of it. First, while I talked fuel with Joe over a glass in the bar. Later, during that evening session with the regular sinners of the community, the idea of Magoffin's outwitting that old partner of his, the devil, with last-minute repentance caused much amusement. Magoffin was a grazier owner at Banyan Station, one of the richest cattle runs of the district. On the lush western slope of the mountains, he was already a legendary figure as a rogue. Originally, he had worked as a stockman on Banyan. The story went that his rise to ownership was due to secret collaboration with a notorious cattle thief of the day, who helped him to effect his employer's dispossession by running off the stock, then running it back when Magoffin took over. His collaborator conveniently disappeared, nor had Magoffin's scruples improved with that first great achievement. It was said that he lived for cattle duffing and skullduggery with horses. He had the racing game in the north sewn up. He had been in many a tight spot, but never convicted. If it looked as if he could not beat a rap, he put up one of his several half-caste sons to take it for him. Well, the old fellow's days were numbered. He had a kidney complaint that was all set to kill him. The Flying Doctor had been out to see him a couple of times, and had tried to get him to go to hospital down in Cairns. People declared that why he would not go was that he dared not leave Banyan for fear of his sons running off the stock. it might have been that he simply had no such pessimistic view of his future as the doctor. I myself had heard him express himself to that effect, in no uncertain terms, just after the doctor's last visit. That was about a month before this time I tell of, the occasion being a call I made at Banyan with the little padre. His reverence, new as he was to the country, and not so much experienced in the administration of his vocation, hearing that Martin Magoffin was dying, had presumed to give him the consolation of the last rites. I did not see what happened because I was at the fuel shed, while the padre was with Magoffin in the house, but no one within half a mile could fail to hear the old bull roaring. "Don't go pointing the bone at me. I ain't done yet. If you ain't got no other business here but praying for me, mister, get to flamin' hell out of it." I heard that choir boy's alto rise loud and clear with righteousness, indignation. "Martin Magoffin, if anyone's going to get to flaming hell out of here, it's you. If you go to your death without repenting the terrible life you've led." Hence the mirth for which, somewhat shamefacedly, I confessed to having been responsible in the pub, while the good little cleric was surely praying that wet afternoon and night for delay in old Magoffin's departure from mortality till he could reach his side, to set a course for him other than to damnation. I must also confess to feeling with strange discomfort that the joke was rather on me, when at dawn next day I woke to find the rain stopped, and on rising saw the mountains reared in the blue-black clarity against a cloudless sky. But as I stood there looking farther, I saw, away to south, the murk of the southeast stream still hanging over sea and mountain, and to north the black wall of a frontal system running in obliquely from the sea to end on the heights, some 20 miles away, in an Alp-like mass, the pearly peaks of which were touched by the rosy fingers of the dawn and convulsed with sporadic lightning. Then I knew that this was no miracle, but just one of those dry patches which not infrequently occur in wet streams flowing over mountains, lasting only for minutes, usually, and never for longer than about an hour. However, it was regarded as a miracle elsewhere. Even as I stood staring, his reverence came sprinting up the deserted street, without his raincoat this time, but with the valise, which later he raised and waved at me, whooping, "What price you weather prophets?" His face was truly cherubic, glowing like the convoluted crest of that menacing cloud mountain, which for a certainty he would not have seen. He came up panting. "You said 3 days." Then, becoming aware of the lack of promise in my expression, he lost his exuberance, asked in a faltering voice, "Why, we can go, can't we?" I pointed to the southerly murk perceptibly nearer. "I'm afraid not. It's closing in. In an hour it'll be as dirty as ever." He gaped at me. "An hour? But we could be over at Banyan in less than an hour. We've got to get off the ground first, and with that stuff up north there, Banyan's sure to be under low cloud, so I'd have to keep to the south to get under it." I pointed to the storm, glad to turn away from those blue eyes, and proceeded to give an awkward lecture on the meteorological conditions. Temporary breaks in stream weather are due to thunderstorms on the peaks. They dry out the moisture. But as I spoke, sunlight struck Pulpit Rock, 3,000 feet up in the clear behind the town. The yellow rock glowed like new minted gold, and the rainforest below it, emerald and cobalt and jet, gleamed like enamel. He interrupted me, crying, "No, man, no, this is providential. I prayed for this." He got in front of me. "It's providential, I tell you. How can we come to harm?" I had to look at him. Then I saw in those eyes no mere request for cooperation in his purpose, but a desperate plea for help to establish his faith for him by affording him opportunity to prove this act of providence for which he'd prayed. Cruel though it would have been to refuse what he asked, I'm sure I should have done just that if I'd thought compliance meant surrender of the first principle of good flying, which is that a pilot must never act contrary to his better judgment. And my better judgment in this situation was that the weather would beat me in the matter of crossing the mountains. However, there was nothing to show that I could not turn round and come back home. So I said, "Okay, I'll give it a go, but I'm pretty certain I won't be able to get you there." Glowing again, he babbled, "Oh, you will, I know you will. The slowest part of flying is, of course, getting off the ground. I found I had to pump a tire of my little kite. Then I had to clear the airfield of wallabies so as not to come to grief in takeoff. When at last we were off the ground and I was giving my time of departure to Irradio Cairns, half of the predicted hour of grace was gone. Now the murk of the stream was no more than 10 miles off, traveling at about 20 knots by my estimate of its sweeping over the craggy heights. As I climbed, I reckoned that with my own 100 knots of airspeed, I would just about be able to beat it across to the point where I hoped to get under the cloud I believed covered Banyan. That my reckoning was wrong I discovered when I reached 2,000 and got my first glimpse of the intramontane landscape through a saddle. Then I saw what I should have foreseen, that the Pooh was already across my track and flowing faster back there. Above the engine's roar, I shouted to my passenger sitting by me on the right, "Look at that." He merely smiled and nodded, as most passengers do, whatever you show them, uncomprehending. Not that I was thinking of turning back. As yet the stuff was streaming over the gully up which I looked. I knew that gully, which was about 500 feet deep by a mile across, and reckoned I had a good chance of getting through it. I leveled out. Soon we were under the feathery gray mass, so close to it that wisps were torn down by the propeller and spun into a rainbow. I'd done the kind of thing before and knew that my luck would hold only as long as the conditions held that were keeping the cloud mass up out of the gully. Hence I knew at once that our sacred mission was at an end when suddenly it grew dark. I was already turning back when the rain engulfed us like a breaking wave. My passenger shouted, "You're not turning back." "Sorry, but I told you what to expect." "No, please, we'd only come to grief if we went on." "We can't come to grief." "I know." "You know nothing about it. Now keep quiet. I've got to concentrate." I could feel his eyes on me. I wondered if he thought I might be the devil thwarting him in his sacred work. Not that the thought worried me. With the kite bucking in the sudden turbulence, and the instruments trying to go haywire, and the engine running rough with ice, when I could spare a glance off the instrument panel, I saw that he was withdrawn, sitting hunched in his safety belt, staring sightlessly out into the gray opacity. I climbed to 4,000 to make certain of clearing anything thereabout, heading somewhat south of east. which I estimated would, with northerly drift, bring me in about 15 minutes to a point a couple of miles out to sea opposite the town. After the 15 minutes had passed, I dropped down on a southerly heading to find the sea. Flying on instruments, you have to keep your eyes pretty well glued to the panel, because without God's horizon to give you orientation, there is no knowing anything but what your instruments tell you, whether you are flying up or down, hell, west, or crooked, no matter how clever you may be. But although you are not looking out, you still retain awareness, at least of a change of conditions out in front, which is just as well as many a pilot has lived by the skin of his teeth to know, I among them. Suddenly I became aware of darkening of the pearly gloom, looked up, surprised because I'd not made a third of the descent to the sea, to see the windshield blurred with rain, green rain. I was in the trees. What one does in such emergencies seems to be purely automatic. Throttle and stick. I was 500 feet up out of those trees before I properly felt the shock of seeing them and became aware that I was flying full bore just about vertically. I throttled back and trimmed for normal climb and pulled her head round east from the northwesterly heading I found her on. I noticed a tremor in my hands. I glanced at my passenger to see if he saw it. He sat as before, evidently oblivious of the fact that he'd just been within an ace of making the trip into eternity himself. It was clear what had happened. Wind, with the onset of rain, can rise to considerable force, whereas I'd allowed in my rough calculation to offset northerly drift for about 20 knots of wind. The actuality, since I was still over the mountains when I should be well out to sea, must have been all of 50. How far north had I come, I soon found out. Zip. I heard the radio blow out. The plane bucked violently. For a moment I was blind. Lightning. I was in the vicinity of that storm. I must get out of it, or we'd be torn to pieces. Head south, but as I swung her, the compass swung dully with her, and I knew on that instant that it had been put out of action by the flash. I felt the sweat pour from me. The turbulence became violence. My passenger was flung against me. I yelled, "Tighten your belt and take a grip on the bottom of your seat." His blue eyes were goggling and his lips moving. The thought that he was praying filled me with sudden anger. His praying had got us into this. It was left to me to get us out. How? But I had no time to think. The jigging artificial horizon on which I was concentrating to keep us on an even keel suddenly toppled. My eyes leapt to the bat and ball, which showed us skidding violently to starboard. Then I became aware that we were going up, apparently sideways, up, up, up. The hands of the altimeter were winding like the hands of a busted clock. We were in an updraft. I pulled off power, strove with the stick. I think we rolled over and over. Lord knows what happened. We were not flying, but being hurled. I saw the altimeter at 10,000, at 12, it might have gone farther. In the violence of acceleration, I lost my power to focus. I just hung there in my harness, helpless, thinking without emotion that here it was at last, the disaster to which I was dedicated as a flyer, the end I had so often glimpsed in moments less frightful. The draught I had already tasted, dry-mouthed a number of times, but now would quaff to the full and die. I remember a period of intense cold in which I hung upside down, then a sensation of wild descent, Suddenly I came to myself with awareness of the unmistakable condition of stall, that feeling of non-flight and flight, communicated to one's being by the very material of the aircraft. Automatically I shoved the nose down, opened the throttle. The engine roared. I saw the instruments again. The artificial horizon was still toppled, but the rest were functioning normally. The altimeter read 2000. The significance of the altimeter reading did not dawn on me till I realized that our medium was no longer pearly cloud, but gray sheeting rain again, and there again was the green of trees. So close did I come to those trees that I recognized them for what they were, bunya pines, stretching long tasseled arms to take us down. So violently did I have to reef out of them that I came close again to stalling. A wall of glistening rock leapt at me. More trees. We were evidently down in some depression in the mountains, some gully or ravine or mere hollow refuge from the wrath of heaven, yet in effect only a kind of limbo in which to suffer till the earth should claim us and send us straight to hell. There was no climbing out, because the downdraft that had flung us in was pinning us down. Trees and rocks everywhere. I flung back my sliding side window for better view, turned to my passenger to tell him to do the same on his side, saw that he was praying, and screamed at him, "If you want to live, quit your bloody praying and keep a lookout." I was frightened, but the expression of my fear was rage. Rage against this passenger of mine who had doomed me along with himself by stealing my will to serve a faith in which he could sit there calmly waiting for violent death. I made a nightmare circle of that death trap, which only revealed itself in glimpses of gleaming rock and streaming trees through the torn silver curtains of the rain. I felt him tug at my arm as I was dragging us out of the bunyas again, and I turned on him screaming, "God damn you!" I could not hear what he said in the noise inside with the windows open, but I followed the direction of his pointing through his window and saw a narrow strip of silver in the gray, like dawn breaking on a misty sea, a saddle escape. I turned to it, leveled out, rushed it at full bore. In a moment we were out over the mountainside, flying smoothly down what I knew from the open forest was the western declivity, down under a low sloping ceiling from which hung wisps like old cobweb. I glanced at my passenger. His face was cherubic. I gave him a wobbly grin. Now I had to locate myself. I was over lightly timbered granite hills. There was a grassy valley with a silver river and red cattle. It looked familiar. Then suddenly there it was, revealed by a parting of a curtain of rain, a cluster of whitewashed buildings, stockyards, tanks, beside an emerald patch in a corner of which blew a white windsock banyan. My passenger babbled something, but I didn't hear. My skin felt goosey. I dared not look at him. I concentrated on the landing. Down, 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 over the fence, eyes peeled for wallabies. There they were, as always, squatting amongst the spiked red ant hills. With them were a brace of brolgus, as intent on the technique of my landing as a pair of flying instructors. I rather clunked her in, but didn't give two hoots. It was so good to be back on the ground. I kept the plane rolling on up to the end of the strip, then away to the right up a short taxiway to the homestead. At the gate to the homestead paddock I cut the switches. The sudden stillness struck like a blow. Then into the stillness came insinuating the soft whine of the gyros running down like the unwinding of the tension the flight had coiled tight in plane and pilot. I wanted to drop my head to my hands, to sleep a little, even perhaps to weep a little, in my weariness and relief, but you don't do things like that in front of passengers who must never know what their flight had cost beyond the charter fee. His little reverence spoke first, calmly, smugly. Well, we got here, as I said we would. I sought for an ironical reply, but was checked by the sound of voices. A group of women and children of various shades of duskiness were approaching the gate. I got my reply as he opened the door. I said dryly, "Let's hope the old boy waited for us." He alighted and spoke to the group, now halted at the gate. "Good day, everybody," regarding him in the shy underlids fashion of aborigines. They murmured a greeting. He asked cheerily, "I hear the boss is sick. How is he?" No one answered. He asked quickly, "He's not dead?" An oldish half-caste woman answered, "No, he ain't dead." He sighed, "Ah, I'd like to see him. He ain't home, eh? He been get better last night. 'S mornin' he been go out longa boy, lookum bullock." "Oh, when do you expect him back?" "This evenin'. But he proper cranky. Reckon somebody steal him stock. He been say the phone's doctor, or somebody come tell him to get to hell out of it. More better you go, eh?" His face stiffened. "No, I'll wait for him. Could you give us something to eat?" Reluctantly they gave us a meal in the kitchen. I left the padre there and went back to look the kite over for damage. Afterwards I got into the back seat and dozed. I was roused by voices. The women and children were at the gate again, and with them was the little padre, standing with arms folded, looking very stern and brave. Then I saw horsemen approaching. I stayed put, not wishing to get mixed up in the inevitable fireworks. But there were no fireworks after all. Martin Magoffin was one of the horsemen, sure enough, but instead of sitting his saddle like the rest, he hung across it, dead. Well, the little padre had the satisfaction of burying the old reprobate. More than that, he baptized the whole of the Magoffin family. I was their godfather.